Friedman stressed the conflict of proper and improper goals for Fed policy in his presidential address to the American Economic Association in 1967. He first discussed what the Fed cannot do. His two negatives for Fed policy were attempts to peg interest rates and influence the level of employment, the two real variables suggested in the Employment Act and the Accord. The Fed, or any central bank, as Friedman emphasized, controls nominal quantities, particularly the dollar quantity of its own assets and liabilities. And by this means, the dollar quantity of base money in the economy. It acquires assets by buying government securities, which it pays for by creating new money. Now, it's important to understand, for those of you who want to understand money, to understand that anything the Fed buys and pays for with a check is now monetized. If when Congress passed the old Clunkers, the old Clunkers Act.
Cash for clunkers.
What is it?
Cash for clunkers.
Oh yeah, cash for clunkers. One lady wrote me and said, well, never mind. If the Fed if they had the Fed buy those clunkers, that would have been more to the point, because the Fed, when it paid for them, would have created new money. And then all it would have had to do was crush the clunkers and give them to the steel mills. But anything that the Fed pays for by a check is going to add to the existing quantity of money. Ordinarily, the only thing it's been buying has been government securities for a good long time. And of course, that's in a sense okay, because it reduces the outstanding national debt. It monetizes the national debt. Now, if we monetize the entire national debt, of course, we'd have skyrocketing inflation. That's what the hyperinflations in Central Europe were, and in Germany after World War I. The actual money is either Federal Reserve notes, which all of us have some in our wallets or pocketbooks right now, or it's new bank reserves, which are the checking account reserves of ordinary banks at their Federal Reserve banks. By this powerful operation, the Federal Market Committee can fundamentally control the domestic price level, as Friedman explained. Fed officialdom, however, has always had other ambitions. In their view, stabilizing the price level has hardly ever been necessitous and never an exclusive goal. They presume comprehensive control over, they have the mistaken notion, oh, wait a minute, I think I missed it somewhere here. Over real variables, output and employment particularly, things that Friedman told them that they lacked the tools and skills to achieve. So they haven't listened to Milton Friedman. To counter Friedman's restrictive arguments, Fed officials have encouraged the idea that monetary policy means control of interest rates. And if you read the Wall Street Journal, you'll see that fact emphasized every day. They say that the Fed, that monetary policy operates through interest rates. Well, we'll see how wrong that is in a minute. Which then influence output and employment by means of a mysterious process that only central bankers can comprehend. Unfortunately, they have been very successful in getting a large majority of observers to believe this fiction. They seldom refer to money as such. That is, I refer to money meaning the stock of money in existence right now, and that's currency or deposit subject to check at a bank or a saving institution. But they call it, instead of money, they use a term like controlling the available quantity of credit. Well, that's a typical bureaucratic kind of statement. The clear-cut result of their policies over almost 10 decades, since 1913, has been consistent inflation. In the 97 years since passage of the Fed Act, the value of the dollar has fallen 96%. What a nickel bought in 1912, it takes $1 to buy today, roughly. By way of contrast, during the century of the gold standard, the dollar's purchasing power remained virtually constant. In 1923, if you had a shopper, a housewife, had $5 to spend on groceries, she would get about the same quantity of groceries as the shopper in 1823 who had $5. Now that's a pretty good record. I don't believe there's a central bank, I know there's none that can match that, nor will there ever be one that can. Occasionally, Congress has considered a bill mandating that the Fed maintain price stability. It's not been enough of a priority, but one Fed spokesman who did accept it was Alan Greenspan, but it never has come to pass. In the late 1980s, he and several Federal Reserve Bank presidents were pushing for it, but there was a bill by a Democrat no less, from North Carolina, Stephen Neal, which wanted to make price level stability the unequivocal goal of Fed policy. But there were too many counter forces in the Fed and out of it that wanted the Fed to have more hands-on control, and so the bill didn't get through. All of the current Fed officials, if you've noticed, reading in the Wall Street Journal, suggest that inflation rates between 1.5% and 2.5%, and sometimes even more, are acceptable or desirable. Many of them have the mistaken notion that some degree of inflation is a good thing because it leads to higher levels of employment, which has been discredited by Friedman and others. A recent Wall Street Journal article dated May 20th this year said, inflation at 44-year low. 44 years, and it's at the lowest point it's been in 44 years, and it's between April of 2009 and 2010, it was only 0.9%. Now that's not zero, and zero is the ideal rate of inflation. I'll take that back. Milton Friedman proved that -2% is even better, but I won't try to argue about that. But zero is something everyone can understand, and it's very possible and easy to implement. The authors gave the standard journalist view of monetary policy. Quote, while central bankers typically worry, now get this, about too much inflation. How can they worry about too much inflation when they make the inflation? That's absurd. Too little can also be a problem. If prices don't rise enough to allow the Fed to increase its interest rate target from the current near zero level, policymakers would be left without much room to ease rates if the U.S. economy takes a turn for the worse. This observation is absurd. The Fed controls a stock of money without exception. By this means, it can generate any level of nominal spending that it wants and any level of inflation. These journalists and Fed bureaucrats have simply ignored what Friedman spelled out for them in his presidential address. As he concluded there, the monetary authority controls nominal quantities. It cannot use its control over nominal quantities to peg a real quantity, the real rate of interest or the rate of employment. In another article, he said, our findings give no support to the view that now widely popular, that, and that was 1964, that long-run inflation is favorable to economic growth. The origin of the Great Recession of 2008 is certainly not monetary. It is very real, unlike the Great Contraction and Great Depression of 1929 to 41.